All right, well, welcome everybody. Very glad to have you all here today. My name is Callum McDonald. I'm the Vice President of Labour Market Intelligence with Tourism HR Canada. I'd just like to start by letting you know that this is a pre-recorded session. I'm actually live in the chat as well as speaking to you during the presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions that you might have as we go forward. I'm going to be discussing the values and sentiments towards the tourism sector as a traveler and how those are changing. We're also going to be discussing how tourism is perceived as both an economic driver and a place of work. Today's presentation is about 45 minutes in length, and at the end, we are going to be posing 3 open-ended questions to you so that we can gather your feedback, which will help inform the work we do to help the tourism sector recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our starting point is to look at some broad trends. These are not perceptions or sentiments per se, but they are trends that are being driven by changing values and practices within our society. And these trends will have an impact on the tourism sector. How big of an impact is yet to be determined. Some of these changes were already occurring before the pandemic and were sped up because of them. But how strongly they will necessarily embed themselves in our society and how long and how strongly they will last after the pandemic is not 100% certain. These trends that I'm going to be looking at are remote work, remote living, virtual events, and vaccine hesitancy. The first trend is remote work, and this trend was already developing prior to COVID-19. The internet, the ability to meet face-to-face on virtual platforms. In many occupations, you could work from anywhere prior to the pandemic. Office workers in particular had options to work from home for companies whose headquarters might be in another province or even another country. But for the most part, there was a central office. Most of the company's employees were going in there day in and day out, more days than not. And more people were moving to work from home arrangements, but it was more of a trickle rather than a flood. COVID-19, of course, changed that quite rapidly, but more important, it kind of cemented this change in society. It also clearly showed that many more occupations could be performed from home than thought. Companies, for example, whose workers required access to a secure network, they had to figure out how they could do that remotely. And now that they can, there's no necessary reason for them to go back to a single location to access that network. This data comes from Statistics Canada's Business Conditions Survey. And in surveying businesses across Canada, 30% of businesses say that post-pandemic, at least half of their workers will continue to work remotely. Now, of course, many jobs cannot necessarily be done from home, and that means that there's going to be a higher share of people working from home focused on office workers. This is a trend that's probably going to embed itself and continue long after the pandemic. And that means that the impact that the pandemic has had on the coffee shops, the restaurants, the pubs, the recreation facilities that are in our urban cores will not necessarily quickly lift once the pandemic ends. Those places are part of the tourism sector, but most of their customers are locals, particularly during off-peak tourism seasons. They're very important, though, in terms of the infrastructure that surrounds the visitor economy. The big attractions, things like Parliament Hill, museums, the CN Tower, Vancouver Aquarium, they're going to continue to be there and draw tourists in. But those tourists in turn may find that there are fewer places where they can go and quickly grab a coffee than prior to the pandemic. On the flip side of this, there will be more demand for restaurants and recreation facilities in suburban areas. One interesting caveat to this trend, though, that we've been thinking about is if you're not commuting downtown 5 days a week, are you more likely to go downtown for the nightlife during the week, during the evening, or on the weekend? Who knows? Mobile population. If you're going to be working remotely, there's not as great a need to live as close to the office. So why not get out of the city entirely? Nova Scotia, in fact, has started a campaign that encourages people to live in the province while they work remotely elsewhere. But selling your house, finding a new one, uprooting your family, that's a bigger undertaking than turning the den into an office. This trend's not as solid as the work from home trend, but it has similar implications. Work from home means fewer suburban dwellers spending money at downtown restaurants during work week. If the condo dwellers move away, then local demand could drop even further. Again, that doesn't necessarily affect the attractions as much, but it will have an impact on those urban restaurants and smaller recreation facilities. Now, there is a question of exactly where people are moving to. Is it moving to the suburbs, small cities, rural areas, and to what degree? There is certainly a lot of discussion about this trend and some data to support what people are talking about. We do know from Canada's population estimates that, for example, Toronto and Montreal, they actually have seen their population decline, and that population is moving into surrounding suburbs and bedroom communities. Will this continue post-pandemic? The signals here aren't quite as strong. Vancouver, for example, they've actually been adding to their urban population. And the data also can't tell us if this is having an impact on small communities or on rural areas. Certainly not in large enough numbers, or certainly can't tell us if it's happening in large enough numbers to impact the local labor force in these small communities. Virtual business. So this trend is also fairly strong, and again, it affects those urban cores. This time particularly impacting the hotels as well as the restaurants and the recreation facilities. And of course, it also would have an impact on the airport, hotels, and the conference centers that serve these events. And of course, certainly has an impact on the transportation industry, particularly airlines, whose high value clients come from the business traveler segment. Video conferencing, other digital tools, these can create cost savings, and of course, carbon reduction is also factored in here. These are reasons for businesses to continue to host events virtually. The Conference Board of Canada's Tourism Market Outlook shows demand from business travel remaining below 2019 levels, at least out until 2024. And a study by McKinsey, consulting out of the US, estimated that potentially 20% of business travel could just never return. The vaccine rollout. Well, of course, this has a lot of implications for the reopening of the visitor economy. The speed with which the population is vaccinated will determine when a full reopening can occur. And we know there's been some problems during the initial rollout, and the pace varies from province to province. Ontario has targeted August 2021 for making the vaccine available to anyone who wants it. Other provinces and territories have slightly different timelines for making the vaccine widely available to anyone. British Columbia is targeting July through September. Meanwhile, the territories are well ahead of the provinces in terms of getting the vaccine into people. But the more people that are vaccinated, the more transmission will go down. But regardless, we're still looking at around mid-summer before we're talking about widespread immunity within Canada. And that brings us to the vaccine hesitancy issue. It has risen in past decades, and it's greater in some countries than in others. In Canada, a Leger study or survey from a couple of weeks ago found that 73% of Canadians say they will get vaccinated once approved. Now, that means 27% of people are somewhat hesitant, but this is a new vaccine, production was sped up. There is some reason for people to be perhaps a little hesitant about this. What's more important is that 10% of Canadians say they will not get vaccinated. Those others can be convinced. These are people saying they will not get vaccinated. Now, 10% should theoretically still allow for a reopening based on what we hear from the experts. In the US, which right at the moment is actually ahead of Canada in terms of getting its population vaccinated, so far only 56% of people said they would get the vaccine upon approval. More importantly, 23% say they will not get vaccinated. Now, while we're ahead right now, of course, this resistance to getting vaccinated could potentially hamper that country's ability to achieve herd immunity. Now, I'm not meaning to pick on the United States here, but the point being is that there are going to be some countries that could still have a significant part of their population unvaccinated, while others are fully vaccinated. And policy-wise, this means there could be continued restrictions on travelers from some market segments, or we could have our borders open to those market segments. Those people may not want to travel here if their home country has restrictions on returning visitors. So these are just some considerations basically to say international travel will probably start to come back at some point this year, but it may not be a case where the borders simply reopen to all countries, all comers at once. And another point to make is that this summer, the vaccine itself is not going to be enough. By summer, we know that vaccination efforts will have significantly ramped up. Perhaps even a majority of Canadians will be vaccinated, But we don't know if herd immunity will be achieved, and even if there is, it's likely to be lingering concerns on the part of Canadians. Cleanliness, safety, hygiene, it's still going to be very important this summer, particularly now that we have variants of the virus circulating that are more contagious. The vaccine is effective against those variants, but the higher contagion rate could partially offset the benefits of having a portion of our population immune to the virus. I've also heard some suggestions that there may be a bit of a dichotomy in the customer base. Some people are going to be vaccinated, or even if they're unvaccinated, they're seeing low transmission levels, assuming that's the case, and they're going to have a strong desire to get out and act and enjoy the world as they did pre-COVID. Others, and this is probably going to be the majority, are still somewhat hesitant and want to continue following social distancing protocols and see the same behaviors in other customers. And that's potentially two different customer bases that you could market yourself to, but it also creates some conflict management issues as both groups of people circulate within society. So how is all of this going to affect how people travel? There are some people who are, they're comfortable and willing to travel today. They're ready to go. But in terms of what large numbers of people are comfortable with, initial movement is likely to be to nearby communities, with further distance travel only occurring as overall comfort levels rise. Travels to close by destinations that does not lead to increased transmission will in turn lead to greater comfort with traveling to location further afield. But initially, travel is likely to be focused on outdoors and outdoor activities. Since very early in the pandemic, Destination Canada has been tracking Canadians' level of comfort with their own travel to a location and their level of comfort with visitors from those locations coming to their own community. This resident sentiment monitoring has been ongoing, and there should actually be a couple of new ones out by now, but I chose the one from February 16th because it measured both variables, comfort traveling to and welcoming visitors from a location. And as you can see, depending on what province they are in, the percentage of Canadians saying they were comfortable traveling to communities near themselves range from 50% to 74%. The percentage of Canadians saying they were comfortable with travelers coming to their community is a little bit lower, ranging from 37 to 64%, again, depending on the province they were in. Go further afield, and confidence drops. It is similar in that people are more comfortable with traveling to a location than they are with welcoming someone from a location. But on both metrics, once the distance increases, the comfort level drops. And increase the distance even more, and you start asking about comfort with interprovincial or interterritorial travel. And once again, comfort levels drop, the willingness to welcome travelers or to travel themselves decreases. As of mid-February, less than half of Canadians, in some provinces, less than 20% of Canadians were comfortable traveling to another province or to another territory. And of course, I don't think this is going to surprise anybody, but there is very low levels of comfort when it comes to welcoming visitors from outside of Canada. On the other side of that, of course, most Canadians are not comfortable traveling to other countries either. This means international travel from other countries is likely to be very limited this year. We already know the international cruises will not be occurring in Canadian waters this year, and events that require a long lead time, so large conferences, large tour groups, they're going to be limited by that planning requirement. Even if the border opens, there's not enough time to necessarily plan those out before early summer. But many Canadians will, at the same time, be choosing to travel within Canada instead of to other countries. It's important to note that as COVID cases in a region rise or fall, that level of comfort tends to rise and fall as well. As confidence with close by travel goes up or down, so does confidence with travel to farther distances. But overall, they stay relatively stable compared to each other. People are already fairly comfortable and receptive to travelers from nearby, but it's going to take time for comfort levels with international travel and receptivity to travelers from outside of Canada. It's going to take time for that to rise. And comfort is very much linked to COVID-19 transmission. These rates of comfort have stayed relatively stable over time. but they do tend to go up when COVID transmission goes up and come back down as it goes back down. So basically what it's going into summer. Comfort with travel is linked to COVID-19 transmission. Distance matters. Canadians will be ready to travel to other regions of this country well before they're ready to travel outside of it. And distance matters, whether Canadians are traveling themselves or welcoming visitors. This does suggest that as case counts go down around the globe, the general population is not going to be putting a lot of pressure on the government to open borders or do so in a way that doesn't come without some form of restriction. One additional statement I should make here, and this was some data I just found fairly recently. Actually, maybe I'll just leave this to the next slide here. Currently, comfort levels are directly linked to health risks. I've already stated that a few times, which in turn are linked to the vaccination. A Leger survey of Canadians done in mid-February when case counts were still coming down from January's peak found that at that time, 54% of Canadians thought you should either cancel or postpone a spring break. But on the positive side of that, the survey from the week earlier found that 59% of Canadians said that once they're vaccinated, they planned on eating in a restaurant. Other data stemming from Destination Canada's Global Tourism Watch shows that 61% of Canadian travelers say they can't wait to get out and travel again. However, our own survey of 5,000 Canadians, which was also done using a Leger panel, shows that Canadians are also planning on avoiding places where they come into close contact with people they don't know, at least for the next couple of months. So it's a mixed bag of sentiment towards travel out there right now. People want to get out and travel, but they need to feel they can do so in a safe way. And we also know from some data in the national tourism indicators that spending last summer on pretty much every type of tourism commodity was down, with one exception. So spending on hotels was down, spending on restaurants was down, spending on travel services was down. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. The exception was pre-trip expenditures. Now, pre-trip expenditures is a terminology that's it's associated with the national tourism indicators. Most people wouldn't necessarily be familiar with it, but it's basically, it's what you buy before you go on your trip. And that was up 23% year over year approximately. And it was things like tents, RVs, camping equipment, all of that sort of thing. We don't have the data for the fall yet, but I've got a feeling as we go into fall, you would have found spending on things like skis, etc. All those winter outdoor activities would have gone up as well. This, combined with the broad trends such as mobile work and weak business travel, suggests that a lot of the travel that happens this summer is going to be Canadians traveling to rural or local communities near them and engaging in outdoor activities. And so these regions could in fact see something of a boom in demand and in turn increased demand for labor, while the urban cores still see relatively weak demand compared to pre-pandemic times. Tourism as an economic driver. Here I would describe the sentiment as positive but uncertain. In 2019, we did a survey on Canadians' perceptions of tourism as an economic driver. And at that time, we were seeking to understand not only their perception, but if they understood tourism's scope. We felt in late 2020 that it was time to redo this in order to see if the pandemic had negatively affected Canadians' perceptions of tourism as an important part of the economy. So this comes from the 2019 survey. And at that time, we learned, one, that many Canadians have worked in the tourism sector, but many of them don't know that they've worked in the tourism sector. When asked a straight up question, have you ever worked in tourism? 13% of Canadians say, yes, I've worked in the tourism sector. When you break that down and ask them by industry group, have you worked in a restaurant? Have you worked in a hotel? Have you worked in the transport of an airline? All of a sudden it jumps up to 38% of Canadians saying they have done so. And of that 38% of Canadians who have worked in the tourism sector at some point, 73% had their first job in one of the 5 tourism industry groups, such as accommodation, food and beverage services, transportation, travel services, or the recreation and entertainment sector. So basically, at some point in their life, a third of Canadians have worked in tourism. They just may not realize it. And for 28% of respondents out of the entire sample, their first job was in tourism. In fact, more Canadians have had their first job in tourism than any other industry, although retail is a close second. However, even if they don't necessarily realize how large and expansive, or the fact that they've worked in tourism at some point in their life, most Canadians do have a sense that tourism is an important economic driver. This data is from the survey we did in late 2020. This was in October. We conducted a general population survey of 1,500 Canadians using Léger's national Omni panel. And what we found is that nearly 9 in 10 Canadians believe that the tourism industry is either important or extremely important to the economic well-being of both their province and Canada as a whole. While fewer Canadians see the economic benefits of tourism to their own community, a majority still believe it's important. And in general, Canadians are receptive to tourism. They want visitors to come to Canada, and they want them to have an enjoyable experience, and they want to make those visitors feel welcome. A minority of Canadians, admittedly a sizable one, do feel that visitors can prevent locals from enjoying their community, and that too many visitors can lessen their feelings of safety. But overall, I'd say that when it comes to tourism as an economic driver, the general sentiment is positive. The majority of Canadians either agree or strongly agree with statements such as tourism creates growth opportunities for businesses. Tourism creates a large number of jobs for residents. Tourism supports a diverse number of amenities, such as attractions and restaurants and events. It generates tax revenue for government, and conferences support the economy. But while overall sentiment towards the sector is generally positive, the pandemic has had an impact. A little over 1/3 of Canadians report that perceptions of the tourism industry have become increasingly negative since the beginning of the pandemic. However, a sizable number of Canadians' perceptions have not changed and remain fairly positive towards tourism. In both 2019 and in 2020, we asked Canadians if they thought the number of visitors coming to Canada was too few, too many, or just the right amount. When we compare the response from both years, so pre-pandemic and in October, so right in the middle of things, we see that the share of Canadians who say that the number of visitors coming to Canada is just the right amount, that really hasn't changed. Where change has occurred is there's been a decrease in the number of people saying Canada needs more visitors to come to Canada. There's also been an increase in the number of Canadians saying they don't know if the number of visitors coming to Canada is too few or too many. So basically what we're seeing is right now an unwillingness to increase visitation levels. And of course that would tie in with the comfort levels with international travel that we saw earlier, as well as just a general uncertainty about what is the right mix of visitation for Canada. Similarly, we see a slight decrease in the percentage of Canadians saying Canada is well equipped to handle the current number of visitors. We actually see a slight decrease in the percentage saying that the number of visitors puts too much pressure on our society, infrastructure, and environment. And that's probably because we don't have a whole lot of visitors coming to Canada right now. But again, we see that increase in the number of people saying I don't know, they're uncertain. Again, in both in 2019 and 2020, those who said the current number of visitors puts too much pressure on Canada's society, infrastructure, and environment were asked an open question. They were asked in what way are visitors applying pressure to Canada? And respondents, it was an open question, they could answer whatever they wanted. We then grouped those responses in thematic areas. These are the responses from 2019, and at that time, there were a whole range of reasons why people thought visitors were putting pressure on Canada's society. These are just the top 6. The highest one got 13% of respondents, so none really stood out significantly relative to others. The largest share was concerned with illegal immigration and visitors not leaving. There were also concerns about strain on infrastructure, overcrowding, the environment, and so on. Jump ahead to 2020, and it's COVID-19 all the way. People are concerned that tourism will spread the virus. Infrastructure does remain somewhat of a concern, as do immigration concerns, but 22% of respondents were saying it's the virus and the potential for spread that I'm concerned about. And I'd say it's actually higher than that. The way we group some of these, I'd argue that things like the need for safety precautions, or saying that now is just not the right time to travel, those are also really linked to the virus. So it's more than 20% that are actually saying they're concerned or that pressure is being applied by too many visitors coming to Canada. That said, I'll remind everybody, these are the responses from a small minority of respondents, the ones who were saying that pressure is being applied, and that's only 12% of our entire respondent base. So generally, I'll just sum up by saying Canadians generally do see tourism as a positive economic driver, even if they don't quite understand how big and important the tourism sector is and how widely it's spread across Canada through a large number of different industries. Perceptions have become more negative due to the pandemic, but so far this seems to be driving uncertainty about tourism rather than creating outright hostility to the sector as an economic driver. It's still a very small majority of Canadians that think we're bringing in too many visitors, and that's very much linked to COVID-19. Now, what we do need to be careful about, though, is as we move forward, we reopen in such a way that we don't turn that uncertainty into hostility, but we bring those people back to the perception that tourism is indeed an important economic driver for the Canadian economy. As we saw, a large number of people have worked in our sector. In 2016, we actually did a survey that was very specifically linked to perceptions of tourism as a place of work. And we ran a follow-up survey in November of 2020 because we wanted to see, one, what are the current perceptions of tourism as a place of work during the pandemic. We also wanted to see how the pandemic had changed perceptions. So we reran several of the questions that we had done previously. This is from that survey done in November of 2020. It was a survey of 5,000 Canadians. 20% of the sample in this survey had worked in tourism previously. 6% were currently working in the sector. They identified that compensation and career opportunities were a key issue that they were concerned about. 39% of all respondents did say that their perception of tourism as a place of work had been negatively impacted by COVID-19. And 22% said that in order to work comfortably in the sector, widespread vaccination is needed. People who were working or had worked in one of Canada's 5 tourism industry groups, for the most part, said that they were very satisfied, or at least somewhat satisfied, with the job that they had had while working in the industry, or the job they currently had in the industry. The recreation and entertainment industry, which covers a wide range of businesses, golf courses, museums, theaters, ski resorts. 16% of our respondents had worked or were working in that industry, and of them, 70% said they were satisfied or very satisfied with the job they had. At the lower end were accommodation and food and beverage services, but still a majority of those people who had worked in that industry said they were generally satisfied with the job they have. And yet, despite that, we know that only 6% of our respondents were currently working in the industry, whereas 20% had previously worked in the industry, in the tourism sector, I should say. Most of the respondents were former tourism workers. Despite this job satisfaction, people move on. This is a high turnover sector. And when asked why they had moved on from the sector, many former workers cited career-related issues. 34% said they had other or better career opportunities. 22% said they wanted to change their career. 13% said they left because there was a lack of career advancement. Now, this is probably because 31% also said it was just a temporary or summer job during their time as a student. They may never have seen the job as a career. Other issues cited were competitiveness of the wages, benefits, and the type of work that was being offered. 6% of those who had worked in the tourism industry previously did say that they had been laid off because of COVID-19. And then we also had 4%, so a fairly small group, but they said they had left the industry because they had concerns due to the pandemic. And when asked why they had worked in tourism in the first place, and this is kind of flipping that same question around, 40% of former or current workers said it was because they wanted a temporary job or a summer job while they were in school. And 25% said it was a temporary job while looking for other work opportunities. The strong link to student work is no doubt another reason for the reason people want to work in the sector is the flexibility of the work hours that are on offer. Wages, career opportunity, and the type of work, those were cited by a smaller percentage of respondents when asked why they decided to work in tourism. However, the desirability of working in all of these industries has taken a significant beating due to COVID-19. This question was posed to all respondents, so all 5,000, regardless of whether they had worked in tourism, were currently working in tourism, or had never worked in tourism. We asked, prior to COVID-19, how desirable was a career in each industry group. And if you look at each industry, desirability prior to COVID is the top line. Now, the general desirability of a career in any of the 5 industries was not great prior to COVID-19. Only recreation and entertainment had more Canadians saying that a career was desirable than undesirable. But post-COVID, which for each industry is the line on the bottom, you can see that the perceptions of a career in every tourism industry has suffered significantly. For both accommodation and food services, 62% of our respondents said a career is undesirable. Only 11% said a career is desirable, and the perception of careers in the other industries is not much better at this time. This negative shift occurred amongst respondents, whether they had experience working in tourism or not, but it is worth noting that although the negative shift occurred amongst almost all of our different respondent groups, we broke this down by a number of different demographics. The post-COVID desirability of, post-COVID desirability of tourism careers was most positive amongst young people and new immigrants to Canada. It hadn't suffered as much amongst those 2 demographic groups. To help assess why the desirability of a career in tourism was so low, we asked respondents who had no experience working in tourism why they had never worked in the tourism sector in the first place. Now, 34% did say that they were just never interested in a career in tourism in the first place. That's fair. You know, some people, when they're young, they decide, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to go into construction, I'm going to go into the family business. You're not going to get everybody wanting to work in every single industry. But the career opportunities pops up once again. People said they didn't want to work in tourism because they had other or better career opportunities. And once again, we also see careers, knowing too little about the potential for careers, and wages and the type of work also crop up as issues. So overall, we can see that interest in a tourism career remains low. When we just asked, are you interested in a career in tourism, without any discussion of what industry it would be, only 42% of respondents said that a career in tourism is attractive. And unfortunately, that's down 17% compared to the same question we asked in 2016. But there are some bright spots here. Although 50% of young people, and we define those as people aged 15 to 24, say they are not attracted to a career in tourism, 21% say they at least are likely to pursue a temporary career in tourism. New immigrants, defined as those who have lived in Canada for less than 5 years, and visible minorities are the most likely to say they would pursue a full-time career in tourism. Now, while 39% of those who identify as part of a visible minority group agreed with the statement, visible minorities must often take low-paying jobs in the sector, 50% of new immigrants to Canada agreed with the statement, tourism is a good way for new immigrants to enter the Canadian job market. So how can we increase the willingness to work in tourism? Well, 1 in 4 Canadians who have not worked in the tourism sector cited higher pay and more competitive wages. They said this would increase their willingness to work in tourism. And the results revealed that higher pay was an even more important factor for both young people, so again, those aged 15 to 24, and new immigrants to Canada. 30% of new immigrants said higher pay would make the tourism industry more attractive to them. Now, raising wages is easy to say, it's not necessarily easy to do, and it's particularly hard right now when businesses are struggling to make ends meet. The results of this survey also revealed that 46% of respondents would recommend a career in tourism to family or friends, which is a drop of 16% since 2017, when 62% of Canadians said they would recommend tourism as a career. In that survey from 2016, we did find that respondents who had worked in tourism were more likely to recommend a career in tourism compared to those who had no work experience. In other words, almost 69% of those who had worked in tourism said they would recommend a career in tourism to family and friends, compared to 62% of Canadians overall. Now, interestingly, in our 2020 study, we asked the same question and we saw a similar trend, but also less of a drop-off amongst those who had work experience in tourism. They were still more likely to recommend it to their family and friends as a career. So perhaps that's one little bright spot that we can look at here. But I think we need to keep in mind that overall, the trend that we're seeing is one where our workforce has taken a more negative view of tourism overall. Out of the entire total respondents to our survey, 39% said that they have a more negative view of tourism as a place of work than they did prior to COVID-19. And despite the fact that they're still more willing to recommend a career in tourism, respondents who had tourism experience, those who were working or had worked in tourism, were more likely to say that their view had turned negative. 50% of those respondents said their view of tourism as a place of work was more negative than it had been prior to the pandemic. And they see that there is a lot of risk while working in the tourism sector, which of course probably explains why they're taking more negative perception. We asked people to indicate whether they thought on a 5-point scale, each of these different things was a risk or not. And this is the percentage selecting 4 or 5 indicating an extreme risk. And as you can see, those who have worked in tourism, they view the economic stability of the industry as an extreme risk right now. They see it a risk of having their hours reduced because of COVID-19. They see a risk of their job being lost, their place of work closing, having their pay reduced. And of course, they see some risk both to their own health and to the safety of their family and friends. Overall story is one in which our workforce views the industry in a more negative light than they did before. They have less desire to work in the industry prior to COVID-19. Their perceptions of personal health and safety while working in the industry have taken a negative hit. Their personal feelings of comfort and their feelings of job security also have been very negatively affected. Under these circumstances, it's incredibly important that we try as hard as possible to retain the existing workforce that we still have. Programs like the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy are absolutely vital for this. It also does mean that we are going to face a significant challenge attracting new workers to our sector as the visitor economy reopens and demand begins to ramp up once again. And once again, as it reopens, that comfort level or the return of a comfort level to working in tourism is linked to the vaccine. Now, some people say, they're ready to go. They're not too worried about the vaccine or the virus. They're ready to work in tourism now. They're already comfortable. But 1 in 5 respondents would not consider working in the tourism industry until there is a vaccine. And by vaccine, I don't think we were intending to mean that a vaccine would just be available, but they themselves were in fact vaccinated. And also, again, you see that uncertainty factor there as well. People are either waiting for widespread vaccination to work in this industry, or at the time they just don't know. There's that level of uncertainty that's happening. So to just summarize what we've gone over here, there's a number of things that are affecting the tourism industry right now. Broad trends, working from home, perhaps the mobility of the population, demand for business travel, and ultimately the rollout of the vaccine. These are all going to have effects on the amount of demand for tourism goods and services this summer and the location of that demand. Based on vaccine rollouts and current sentiments related to travel, the early period of the reopening is very likely to concentrate travel in areas where people can spread out and engage in outdoor activities, which has implications for the capacity of businesses in those areas to meet that demand, and possibly to find enough workers. On the flip side of that, there could be other regions where businesses have underutilized capacity and many workers remain unemployed. In the longer term, while tourism is still generally viewed as a positive economic contributor to Canada's economy, the pandemic has introduced some uncertainty. There's no question about that. The reopening needs to be managed in such a way that those who are now less certain about tourism's contribution come back to seeing it as a positive thing. It's still a positive view overall. The uncertainty is being driven by COVID, so we just have to manage that reopening in a way that doesn't spook people. And finally, the workforce. There is no question that we have suffered on this front. The workforce sees our industry as more risky. They see us as possibly unsafe, and they see us as more precarious than they did before COVID-19. We are going to have to focus very, very strongly on retaining those workers who are still in our industry. We have lost about 30% of our workforce, and we are going to be challenged bringing former tourism workers back to our businesses as the visitor economy reopens. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for joining. I hope that I have been able to answer any questions you may have been posing to me in the chat function while we've been doing this. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the Labour Market Forum is all about presenting information. It's also about getting information and feedback back from our industry stakeholders. To that end, there is a link that is being posted in the chat function right now. It will take you to 3 open-ended questions that are related to this topic. We've given you 15 minutes, but of course, you actually have as much time as you want to give us your thoughts on how we can help the tourism sector recover. Certainly look forward to hearing from you. And once again, thank you very much for joining. Have a good day, everyone.